A column of tanks and armored vehicles is crossing the Belgian hills, forests and valleys. It is the 17th of December 1944 and Kampfgruppe Peiper has departed for its part in the immense Battle of the Bulge at the end of the Second World War. While the offensive had already started the day before, the young German officer Joachim Peiper only managed to break through the American lines a day later, on the 17th of December. The reasons for this loss of time were mainly heavy traffic and other delays which I discuss in another video. When the Kampfgruppe finally reached the front line in Landsraad from where they would start their attack, it turned out that the units that should have preceded them to break the resistance at the front line had not succeeded in their task. Although this was at one of the weakest defended points of the front line, the resistance they had encountered was actually just from one platoon of around 20 GIs. Peiper took over the command of some of these vanguard units and ordered his tanks to advance into American-controlled territory. They soon came across a small train station near the village of Baugnez. It was defended by only a small American unit, and they stood no chance against the heavy armored vehicles of Peiper. The next village on their road was Honsfeld. Normally, Honsfeld was a few kilometers behind the front line, because soldiers came here to rest and recover for a short period. So the Americans were totally surprised to discover the enemy so far behind their front line. The roadblocks and anti-tank guns at the entrance to the village were not even manned, and everyone was still sleeping when the Germans entered the city. The first group of vehicles of the column of Peiper was called the Spitze. It consisted of some tanks and half-tracks that would lead the breakthrough, followed closely by the main body. In Honsfeld, the Spitze accelerated, left the capture of Honsfeld to the rest of the Kampfgruppe and headed on its own for Baugnez. But when Baugnez came into sight, the Spitze encountered for the first time real American resistance from roadblocks and anti-tank units. After a short but fierce fight, the Spitze broke through the roadblock and entered Baugnez. The fast capture of Baugnez was vital for Peiper's mission to the river Meuse, because if you know that the Kampfgruppe had more than 100 tanks and a total of around 800 vehicles, you can already imagine that the fuel consumption of the Kampfgruppe was massive. Even their lightest tanks on the roads used more than 200 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. The Kampfgruppe just didn't have enough fuel for such a big campaign. But Peiper knew that the Allies had a fuel dump in Baugnez. So the rapid capture of the village gave the perfect chance to refuel their vehicles here. The Kampfgruppe continued its way through the Ardennes, and the next target would be the city of Ligneville. However, at Baugnez, near Malmedy, they spotted a column of American trucks. This column of trucks was Battery B from the 285th Field Artillery Battalion on its way to St. Vith. The 140 men were artillery observers. Their job was to direct the artillery and locate the artillery of the enemy. They were normally kept some distance behind the front line and were therefore very lightly armed. The men were not aware of the immense size of the German offensive while on their way to St. Vith. Although they heard some rumors, but nobody knew exactly how big the offensive was and how deep the Germans already broke through the Allied front line. The inhabitants of Malmedy were already fleeing when the American column drove through their town. But this did not alarm the Americans, because it was a common phenomenon in the war. They came across a roadblock manned by an engineer unit at the outskirts of the city. The engineers were ready to chop down some trees so that they would block the road for the German vehicles. The artillery observers were recommended by them to take a different route at the other side of Malmedy, which was safer. The engineers had heard that German tanks were on their way to Malmedy and that they would probably reach the city within an hour. The artillery observers decided to ignore the advice and take the original route along Baugnez, because they were not aware of the speed of the German offensive, and they would probably have passed the crossroads at Baugnez long before the Germans would reach it. After all, they only had to drive a few kilometers to the intersection at Baugnez. They would turn south there, so they wouldn't encounter the German column when it's heading west. But the trucks were spotted by Kampfgruppe Peiper's Spitze while it was crossing the crossroads, and Peiper's tanks opened fire with their big guns and heavy machine guns. They jumped out of their trucks and sought cover in the ditches at the side of the road. They didn't stand a chance with their small weapons against the tanks. The Germans approached truck column while shooting, and when they were close enough they forced the Americans to surrender one by one, and gathered them in a field near the crossroads. Peiper himself also arrived with the rest of the Kampfgruppe, but he almost immediately followed the Spitze, which was already back on its way to Ligneville. He urged his men to hurry up and not waste time at looting their prisoners. While the men were gathered in the field with their hands above their heads, a man named George Flaps stood up from a parked vehicle, aimed precisely at the group of prisoners, and fired. He pointed his gun at someone else and fired again. Then all hell broke loose. Several machine guns opened fire on the group and spread their deadly barrage over the prisoners for minutes. The prisoners dived to the ground, having nowhere else to hide. The shooting ended after only a few minutes, but then some Germans entered the field. Anyone who showed even the slightest sign of life was shot at close range. Some pretended to be dead while lying wounded on the cold ground. 45 minutes later, most of the vehicles of Kampfgruppe Peiper had moved on to Ligneville. At one moment, one of the still living Americans got up and started to run. Several others followed his example, and soon a whole group of wounded Americans fled from the intersection. They were shot at by some remaining Germans at the crossroads and chased, but most of them managed to escape. In the following hours and days, about 40 survivors of the lost truck column reached the American positions around Malmedy, all describing the massacre that had taken place. In the meantime, Peiper himself had gone after the Spitze to Ligneville, but the Americans had evacuated the town only minutes before the Germans arrived, leaving only some stragglers. Other than some brief fighting and the common war crimes that the Kampfgruppe committed everywhere, not that much happened at Ligneville, so they immediately set off again in the direction of Stavelot, a city of strategic value because of its bridge over the Amblève River. If they could capture and cross this bridge, they would be one step closer to the river Meuse. But by the time the first tanks approached the city, it was getting dark, and Peiper didn't want to risk having to fight his way through the city at night, because his tanks would be vulnerable in the dark, and the road to descend into the city is quite easily defendable. So he decided to call it a day and get some rest so they could attack Stavelot at dawn. That December 17th ended for Joachim Peiper atop the hill at Stavelot. Although he covered almost 50 kilometers, he was hopelessly far from their goal of crossing the Meuse. Above all, however, that December 17th of the Kampfgruppe will always be linked to the massacre that took place at the Baugnez crossroads, along with the bloody trail they drew through every village they had passed. So, I hope you liked the video. I tried to make it better than the previous one, but I believe that in terms of audio and scripting, I didn't really succeed yet. Because the biggest improvements are actually in the organization and animation behind the scenes. So I'm actually just learning to animate and draw while making this video. But yeah, you probably also saw that in the mid part of the video, I changed my drawing style. I did this because I think it was more appropriate to use this drawing style during my discussion about the Malmedy massacre. I also wanted to discuss in more detail who was responsible for the massacre. For example, George Flaps was not actually the only one who was responsible. But then we would have to delve more into the different commanders and officers of Kampfgruppe Peiper, and I didn't have time for that. Maybe I will make a part 2 on this video, but then I would probably focus more on the destruction of the Kampfgruppe and how their whole plan falls apart eventually. That's actually a more interesting story than the breakthrough, I think. But maybe I will make a video about a completely different event first. I'm not quite sure yet. But I certainly do want to make it easier to understand next time. This and the previous video were actually aimed at an audience that already had a lot of knowledge about the Second World War and the Battle of the Bulge. But yeah, anyway, I hope you liked the video.